It was the 18th day of February in the year 1943, and the air over the Kasserine Pass was thick with the dust of defeat and the metallic scent of spilled American 90-octane gasoline. The sun, a disk of brutal, unblinking fire, cast long, distorted shadows across the desolate, rock-strewn Tunisian landscape. In the turret of his Tiger I heavy tank, Major Klaus Richter of the 10th Panzer Division watched the spectacle unfolding before him, and he allowed himself a sharp, dry laugh that crackled over the internal communication system. His gunner, Sergeant Dietl, a man who had seen the frozen hell of the Russian steppes and now the arid vacuum of the African desert, glanced back, the tension in his face momentarily eased by his officer's amusement. They were observing the disorderly, near-panicked retreat of the green American infantry, men who had known the comfort of home just months before, now stumbling back toward the western horizon, abandoning perfectly good material in their haste. Richter did not see soldiers. He saw a spoiled, disorganized rabble, victims of an überfluss, an overabundance, of men and machines that had somehow rendered them soft. Richter's gaze was drawn not to the fleeing men, however, but to the American armor they had left behind, or which was attempting a clumsy rearguard action. He counted 3, then 4, then a 5th of the utterly pitiable M3 Stuart light tanks, their tracks grinding uselessly in the waddy sand. These were the mechanized spearheads of the New World, the shining product of Detroit's enormous factories, and to Richter and his veteran crew, they were a joke, a mobile coffin. They had thin, bolted armor that could be reliably penetrated by the long 75mm cannon of the Panzer IV, let alone the devastating 88mm gun of his own tank. Their profile was too high, their guns too small, and their presence on the battlefield was an insult to the serious, brutal physics of armored warfare. Richter's men had given the Stuart a name that was, in their dark humor, terribly apt. The flying milk bottle, an object easily shattered, designed only to carry liquid to a child, and certainly not the weight of national purpose. His own machine, the Tiger I, was the perfect brutal counterpoint. It was not a mass-produced convenience. It was a devastating, terrifying piece of engineering, an interlocking matrix of steel plates up to 100 millimeters thick, its weight a staggering 56 metric tons. It required a full crew of 5 highly trained men, specialized maintenance, and consumed fuel at a rate that would bankrupt a small nation. But it was, for now, the uncontested symbol of technical supremacy. Germany's doctrine was not based on overwhelming numbers, but on superiority of design and decisive tactical action. The idea that one Tiger could defeat 6 of any enemy tank, a thesis proven time and again from Kharkov to now. Kasserine. Richter felt the truth of this axiom in the slow, powerful vibration of the Tiger's engine beneath him. The Americans, they had the resources, the sheer weight of production that everyone in Berlin feared. But they did not have the guts, the discipline, or the technical insight to turn that bounty into true fighting strength. They had the steel, but they lacked the will to shape it into a hammer. Yet this contempt, this easy dismissal of the Stuarts' presence, was a fatal miscalculation that was already being signed into history. Richter and his entire command were looking through the wrong end of the periscope. They saw the tank, a weak and pathetic machine, but they failed to see the torrent of logistics behind it. They were counting the bottles, but they were ignoring the ocean of oil and the continent of production capacity that had delivered those bottles to their front door. What Richter was observing was not the final product of American power, but its unpolished, disposable first draft. The thin armor, the high profile, the simple mechanical components that made the Stuart a terrible duelist also made it a logistical miracle, a machine that could be produced faster, driven harder, and replaced instantly, drawing not on a fragile, stretched supply chain, but on an unlimited national reservoir. The laughter that warmed Major Richter's throat on that dusty afternoon in February 1943, the mocking, arrogant sound of German tactical confidence, was in reality the first death knell of his own cause, a sound that would soon be drowned out by the thunder of an industrial avalanche. The principle was simple. Technical brilliance and tactical arrogance, unsupported by resource security, is merely a fragile, beautiful target for the coming tidal wave of manufactured inevitability. The M3 Stuart was just the shadow of that wave. While Major Klaus Richter and his men measured war in the unforgiving geometry of armor thickness and muzzle velocity across the sun-scorched, unforgiving miles of the Tunisian rear, a different kind of man was measuring it in gallons, tons, and miles per hour. This was General George S. Patton, Jr., a figure less concerned with the aesthetics of combat than with the brute force kinetics of capacity. He arrived in North Africa following the profound humiliation of the early American defeats, specifically the Kasserine debacle, not with a new tank design, but with a new philosophy. If the enemy was superior in quality, the answer was not to match their quality, an expensive, time-consuming proposition, but to overwhelm them with a limitless supply of speed and metal. Patton's military philosophy was not derived from Clausewitz. It was derived from Ford, from the absolute unyielding truth of mass production. For Patton, the war was not a chess game, but a vast, unrelenting problem of logistics and momentum, and the light, much-mocked M5 Stuart tank was not a deficit. It was the perfect instrument of acceleration. Where German officers saw the tank's thin skin and inadequate gun, Patton saw the Cadillac twin V8 engine, not a powerful engine for a combat vehicle, but a common consumer-grade powerhouse designed for mass civilian use. This was the key. The engine was easily produced, easily repaired, and critically, its component parts were already standardized across the American automotive industry. The Stuart was a logistical triumph disguised as a tactical weakling. It was a vehicle designed not to stand and fight the Tiger I, but to outrun the supply chain that fed the Tiger, and in so doing, render the German behemoth irrelevant. The narrative shifts now from the battlefield to the unromantic, vital arterial flow of supply. It was a flow sustained by the tireless fleet of Liberty ships, those hastily constructed but indomitable vessels that day after day, week after week, vomited forth the material necessary for victory onto the African docks. The dockworkers and stevedores, the anonymous heroes of this industrial narrative, were offloading not hundreds, but 20,000 tons of materiel a day, a relentless, crushing weight of manufactured will. This constant, enormous input was the true engine of Patton's impending success. His most potent weapon was not the 90mm anti-aircraft gun adapted for tank killing, but the 90-octane gasoline that streamed from the terminals and pipelines, a river of petroleum that fueled not just the tanks, but the entire conception of American warfare, a warfare based on mobility, replacement, and expendability. The technical deep dive into this operational genius centers on the non-combat elements that formed the backbone of the Phantom Force, the maintenance battalions, the signal corps, and the fuel distribution networks. Patton demanded forward maintenance, not rear area repair. The Stuart's accessible engines and interchangeable parts meant a breakdown was measured in hours, not days, an impossible metric for the bespoke, highly engineered German machines. More crucial to the deception, however, were the radio nets. The Signal Corps was instructed not merely to transmit clear communication, but to transmit volume. A true heavy armored division would generate an absolute torrent of encoded high-power radio traffic. Requests for heavy artillery fire, priority orders for 75mm shells, frantic logistics queries for 60,000 gallons of bulk fuel. The engineers of deception understood that the enemy did not fight what was in front of them. They fought the intelligence reports of what was coming. By using a handful of light battalions to generate the radio signature of a massive armored spearhead, Patton was already winning the war of perception. In a quiet moment, the general might have looked at a map, tracing the rapid, audacious route of his advance, perhaps uttering the guiding principle that drove his every action. a quote that served as the thesis for the entire American strategy of overmatch. They have a few good tanks. We have a limitless supply of speed and metal. It was the perfect arrogant distillation of industrial warfare. The Stuart tanks were merely the ambassadors of this limitless supply, and their incredible speed, facilitated by the easy logistics of their civilian-derived engines, was about to be weaponized into a tactical illusion, a deception that would force the resource-starved Germans to commit their precious, irreplaceable reserves against a shadow born not of fear, but of the sheer, unrelenting power of the American assembly line. The laughter of Major Richter was about to be met, not with a better tank, but with an unending, catastrophic supply chain. The challenge presented to General Patton was not merely one of combat, but of applied tactical mathematics. The equation was elegant in its brutal simplicity. How does one equate the combat value of 100 M5 Stuarts, machines of acknowledged inferiority, with the psychological and strategic impact of a 400-tank M4 Sherman heavy armored division? The solution was not found in metallurgy or gunnery, but in the realm of deception, logistics, and the weaponization of sound and signal. This was the moment the generals, engineers, and signal specialists began to craft a shadow army, a force designed to defeat the enemy not by killing its men, but by annihilating its intelligence. The first crucial layer of the illusion was laid not with steel, but with radio waves. The Signal Corps was instructed to maintain a state of continuous, high-volume transmission, a deliberate, overwhelming deluge of coded traffic that mirrored the communication patterns of a full 500-vehicle division. A small squadron of a dozen Stuarts would begin requesting priority resupply for 90mm high-explosive shells, a caliber that no Stuart could possibly fire, but which was appropriate for the heavy tanks the enemy feared. They transmitted frantic, complex logistical queries regarding the delivery of 60,000 gallons of fuel a day, the minimum consumption for a large force operating at high speed. This phantom chatter was the first hammer blow, designed to drown German radio intercept stations in a flood of irrelevant, yet terrifyingly consistent, data. The German intelligence officers, starved for hard facts and accustomed to the methodical economic signaling of their own forces, could only conclude that a massive armored spearhead had materialized, moving with a speed and audacity impossible for a conventional force. Concurrently, the engineers executed the tactile components of the fraud. This was the unprecedented use of dummy armor, a strategic commitment of rubber, canvas, and compressed air measured in the precise light tonnage of deception. The objective was the visual, acoustic, and physical signature of mass. At night, the M5 Stuarts were driven in rapid, tightly spaced circular movements, particularly near crucial passes and river crossings. These maneuvers, often maintained for hours in the pre-dawn darkness, served to maximize track marks, ensuring that dawn reconnaissance aircraft would photograph a landscape scored by the dense, crisscrossing tracks appropriate for a battalion-sized legger rather than a mere company. Furthermore, the light tank's Cadillac V8 engines, normally a disadvantage, were run at high RPMs to create a continuous, low-frequency acoustic signature, a sound that, when reflected off the valleys, suggested the sustained heavy metal roar of a full armored column on the move. The true genius lay in the inflatable tanks. Specialized engineer combat battalions were deployed to inflate and position canvas and rubber models designed to mimic the boxy, massive silhouette of the M4 Sherman, and, most crucially, the rarely deployed, near-mythical M6 heavy tank. These were not toys, they were carefully engineered military decoys, their surfaces treated to scatter radar, and their seams designed for rapid deployment. The contrast was stark. The total weight of the rubber and canvas required to fabricate 300 Phantom vehicles was only a few tons, a minor footnote in the vast American supply manifest. This was juxtaposed against the hundreds of thousands of tons of steel that would have been required to construct the real division, the steel that Germany simply did not have the capacity to replace. This use of strategic fluff was the ultimate embodiment of American industrial power, demonstrating that they could not only build vast armies, but also convincingly fake them, all while the real strength was being marshaled elsewhere. The statistical reveal confirms the terrifying economy of this deception. To equip and staff a real 400-tank armored division and to replace its likely combat losses would represent a multi-million-dollar commitment in steel, oil, and manpower. A single M4 Sherman was priced at nearly $100,000. But the cost of creating this perfect 400-tank illusion, utilizing discarded vehicle parts, rubber, canvas, and the time of a single specialized engineer battalion, was calculated at a mere $5,000. This was the true, overwhelming terror of the American industrial supremacy narrative. For the price of a single officer's jeep, General Patton was purchasing the paralysis and strategic misdirection of an entire German corps. They were forcing the enemy to prepare for an avalanche of steel and lead that was, in reality, a collection of painted balloons and a carefully orchestrated lie transmitted over the airwaves. This was not fighting. This was the mathematics of defeat, applied with cold, unforgiving precision. The hour of execution was not marked by a grand offensive, but by a quiet, calculated feint toward the Tunisian coastal town of Sfax, a move designed purely to activate the German intelligence network. The general's orders were simple, yet demanding: relentless speed, continuous motion, and an unceasing transmission of deception. This was the moment the M5 Stuarts, the mocked flying milk bottles, ceased to be tanks and became the ambassadors of illusion, their light, civilian-derived engines screaming a message of overwhelming, unassailable mass. The pacing accelerated immediately, driven by the frantic pace of the American tankers, who understood they were not fighting an armored battle, but a 24-hour endurance race against the enemy's fragile perception. Within 48 hours, the deception had begun to register in the austere, poorly lit headquarters of the German Africa Corps Intelligence Section. Colonel Erich Reinhardt, a man whose thin frame and perpetual exhaustion were the perfect visual cues for a command starved of accurate intelligence and reliable reconnaissance, tracked the incoming reports with a pencil that shook slightly in his hand. The data was simply impossible. From the subsidiary sector alone, reports flooded in detailing an armored advance that was covering ground at a rate that defied standard doctrine. 70 kilometers in a single night, a feat utterly uncharacteristic of American forces to date. Worse, the volume of radio traffic was catastrophic. His intercept teams were overwhelmed, drowning in the flood of coded chatter, the incessant demanding requests for heavy artillery support and priority air cover, signatures not of a light reconnaissance force, but of an entire armored corps moving with the precision of a clockwork offensive. The very speed of the Phantom Division became the most terrifying data point. Reinhardt had known the Americans were rich in fuel, but this implied an unlimited, almost wasteful operational tempo. His reports noted the distinct, continuous low-frequency engine roar that rolled across the valleys, even in the deepest hours of the night. This was the auditory signature of a massive column, its maintenance crews working with a savage efficiency to keep hundreds of heavy engines turning. What he could not know was that the commanders of the M5 Stuarts were driving their light, maintenance-friendly machines almost continuously, accepting the punishing schedule because the logistics of replacement allowed it. They were, in a very real sense, strapping themselves to a locomotive of logistics, making a single, compact light tank battalion execute the work and mimic the signature of a full heavy regiment. Reinhardt cycled through the desperate aerial reconnaissance photos, grainy, high-altitude images that confirmed his fears. There were the tracks, dense and overlapping, the indelible signature of 1,000 vehicles cutting through the waddy sand. He saw the distinctive boxy silhouettes near the staging areas, clearly recognizable as the M4 Sherman, and even, he swore, the faint outline of the monstrous M6 heavy tank, a unit his command had been told was still on the American mainland. He did not know that these images were the products of inflatable canvas and pressurized rubber, easily deployed and quickly abandoned, yet strategically devastating. His entire worldview, which hinged on a careful, measured response to a predictable threat, was collapsing under the weight of an enemy that seemed to possess the capacity for instantaneous, limitless self-replication. The juxtaposition of scales inherent in the deception was the core of its psychological impact. Reinhardt estimated the perceived enemy force, a full division operating at this speed, was consuming upwards of 60,000 gallons of 90-octane gasoline every 24 hours. This was a number so enormous, so utterly incomprehensible to a German staff that was perpetually calculating its operations in terms of remaining railcar loads of fuel, that it constituted a form of psychological torture. Yet the individual American tank commander, driving the M5 Stuart, whose consumption was a fraction of a Tiger I's, carried only a 2-gallon canteen strapped to his armor, a single tiny measure of water against a crushing tidal wave of fuel that stretched back thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean. This gulf between the individual soldier's basic need and the limitless industrial reservoir that backed him was the general's true weapon. The American advance was not merely a military movement, it was the physical manifestation of unrestricted capital and production, and Colonel Reinhardt was watching the shadow of a truly unassailable industrial capacity move across his map, bringing with it the cold, certain dread of inevitable, numerical defeat. The dust of the Tunisian morning, the 20th of February, 1943, was the curtain that concealed the general's masterful, cruel joke. Major Klaus Richter, the veteran of the 10th Panzer Division who had dismissed the American threat with a cynical laugh, was finally granted the opportunity he had demanded. His orders were precise, drawn directly from the frantic, voluminous radio traffic intercepted from the Phantom advance. Engage the forward elements of the American Heavy Division, a spearhead believed to consist of dozens of the dreaded M4 Shermans. Richter, seated within the nearly impregnable confines of his Tiger I, felt the familiar surge of confidence, a confidence born of technical superiority and the proven invulnerability of his magnificent over-engineered machine. He was ready to carve through the soft American line, a precision surgical strike that would expose the deception and halt the Phantom's momentum. He brought his column over a low, dry ridge, the heavy Tiger and its accompanying Panzer IVs poised for the shock of combat against superior enemy armor. The dust of the enemy's advance was still settling, and through the haze the shapes of the American spearhead materialized. Richter lifted his binoculars, focusing the glass with a sharp, involuntary movement. What he saw was not the blocky, aggressive silhouette of the Sherman, nor the impossible mass of the M6 heavy tank. What he saw was a line of the pitiful, high-riding M3 Stuarts, the flying milk bottles, their thin, bolted armor shimmering mockingly in the heat. A profound, bitter wave of derision washed over the major. He lowered the binoculars and let loose another laugh, a sound now infused with a sharper, more dangerous contempt. "The general sent children to play with us," he spat into the throat microphone, his voice edged with fury at the sheer, insulting predictability of the American command. He ordered an immediate, aggressive counterattack, full speed, close the range, annihilate the scout screen. The Tiger. I surged forward, its enormous weight barely registering the accelerator's demand, the powerful 88mm gun traversing slowly toward the unsuspecting inferior enemy. The range closed to under 1,000 meters. This was no engagement. It was a massacre. But as the lead Panzer IVs opened fire, transforming the 1st Stuart into a smoking wreck, the ground around Richter's advancing column did not erupt with counter-fire from more tanks. It was struck by an avalanche of steel and lead descending not horizontally, but from the flanks and the very heavens above. Patton's deception had not been designed to win a tank-on-tank duel. It had been designed to draw the German reserves and force a premature commitment into a perfectly calibrated, three-dimensional kill zone. The Stuarts were the bait. The true weapon was the unlimited capacity of the American supply chain, condensed into the visceral reality of fire support. The German column was instantaneously engulfed by the pre-registered fire of an entire artillery group, delivering 105mm thunderclaps with a speed and sustained intensity the resource-starved Germans could not match. Simultaneously, the sky itself seemed to fracture. The low, purposeful snarl of P-40 Warhawk engines, machines whose pilots had no fear of expending ammunition or running dry, swept down in a furious strafing pass. The laughter died in Major Richter's throat, replaced by a cold, immediate terror that cut through the physical protection of his thick armor. He realized the horrifying geometric truth. He was not facing a single armored division. He was facing the entire, condensed, weaponized industrial capacity of a continent. His Tiger I, the symbol of technical superiority, was hit not by a penetrating shell, but by a close air support thunderclap, a 250-kilogram bomb that exploded yards from the heavy tank, shattering a track and immobilizing the massive machine in an instant. Richter staggered inside the turret, the air suddenly thick with smoke and the ringing echo of the blast. His Tiger was defeated, its vulnerability exposed not by a more powerful weapon, but by the sheer, unending supply of cheap ordnance and high-octane, fuel that permitted the American air campaign to operate with such punishing impunity. The final devastating psychological blow was delivered by a simple juxtaposition of scales. As he ordered his crew to abandon the crippled Tiger, Major Richter glanced at the fuel gauge, then at the single, precious 20-liter jerrycan of reserve gasoline strapped to the hull, the last meager hope of his regiment's advance. At that exact moment, the pilot of the attacking P-40 Warhawk, the anonymous agent of his defeat, was cruising easily back toward his forward airstrip, having expended his entire ordnance load, secured in the knowledge that his machine was supported by a logistics chain that had assigned him 3,000 gallons of aviation fuel for his single mission. This disparity, a single 20-liter can versus 3,000 gallons, was the moment of relinquishment. The war, Richter realized with a sick, sinking dread, was not a matter of tactics or courage. It was an exercise in unending capacity, and the American general had merely used the Stuart to reveal the full, horrifying depth of his nation's inexhaustible well. The mathematics of defeat had just been violently demonstrated, and the turning point had been reached, not by a victory of steel, but by a victory of logistics and illusion. The tactical climax achieved by the general's deception immediately initiated a catastrophic chain reaction that ran backward, not into the American line, but straight through the brittle, exhausted arteries of the German supply system. With their armored reserves prematurely committed and shattered against the phantom spearhead, the entire German command structure was now held in a fixed, defensive posture, facing a threat that was largely manufactured. The reality of German resource scarcity was no longer an abstraction debated in Berlin. It became the central, devastating, dramatic element of the Tunisian campaign. The contrast in logistical philosophies, already evident on the battlefield, became acutely painful in the repair yards. The German tanks, those beautifully engineered masterpieces that Major Richter had so admired, now proved to be their own worst enemy. The formidable Tiger I and the sleek Panther, symbols of Teutonic technical superiority, were designed with a fastidious complexity that necessitated specialized tools, customized parts, and teams of highly trained mechanics. A single major repair, a damaged final drive, a broken torsion bar, often required 24 hours of specialized labor and the arrival of bespoke components shipped precariously across the Mediterranean. This doctrine of technical elegance assumed endless time and infinite resources, assumptions that the war had long since negated. The American counterpoint, the philosophy that undergirded the entire deception, was brutal, simple, and built upon the industrial supremacy narrative. The M4 Sherman and even the smaller M5 Stuart were designed for mass, production, and expendability. A major mechanical failure on the American side rarely warranted the complex surgery demanded by the German machines. Instead, a damaged tank was often simply towed and replaced by a new unit delivered by the next Liberty ship to arrive in port. The American industrial mind viewed the tank not as a precious weapon to be cherished and maintained, but as a component in a larger system, a disposable tool in an inexhaustible chest. The statistical reveal centered on the lifeblood of modern warfare: oil. As the German command wrestled with the tactical disaster, the strategic reality of their fuel reserves delivered the true psychological blow. Intelligence summaries, whispered in hushed tones, calculated Germany's remaining access to petroleum in the finite, dwindling measure of millions of barrels left, a reservoir that was being mercilessly squeezed by Allied strategic bombing. This measure was juxtaposed against the colossal, almost cosmic reality of the American position. The United States' domestic oil production was sustained by a billion-barrel reservoir, an apparently bottomless well of crude that ensured the 90-octane gasoline would continue to flow in a torrent. This differential was not a vulnerability. It was a sentence of defeat. The cascading effect of the fuel shortage was instantly visible in the German logistical paralysis. Colonel Reinhardt, the intelligence officer, noted the horrifying, accelerating hemorrhage of transport vehicles. In the single week following the Phantom advance, his sector reported the loss of over 700 German trucks to air attack, mechanical failure, or lack of fuel. The solution, an appalling return to the 1914 era of warfare, was the immediate and urgent requisition of all available equine power. The Army, the supposed harbinger of the mechanized future, was suddenly relying on 60,000 horses for the most basic forward supply duties, an astonishing, grotesque sign of strategic regression. This desperate scramble to substitute flesh and hay for steel and gasoline was instantly contrasted with the American logistical triumph. In that very same week, the ports of Casablanca and Oran received and began deploying 10,000 new American trucks, machines designed for rough handling, interchangeable parts, and a ceaseless forward momentum. The dominoes were falling with an unyielding mechanical precision. Every American gallon expended was immediately replaced. Every German liter of fuel consumed brought the entire theater of operations one step closer to immobility. The general's deception had successfully forced the Germans to squander their finite, precious resources on a shadow, committing tanks that could not be easily repaired, expending fuel that could not be replaced, and confirming in the German High Command the horrifying truth that they were not merely fighting an army, but fighting an entire industrial continent that could afford to simply throw away resources that were, to the Axis, priceless. The German supply chain was now revealed to be not a robust lifeline, but a brittle, exposed nerve, and the light, disposable M5 Stuart had proven to be the most efficient surgical instrument for severing it. To comprehend the true terror of the general's deception, one must abandon the sun-baked, intimate brutality of the Tunisian passes and travel 3,000 nautical miles west to the heartland of the American industrial supremacy narrative, where the true war was being fought and irrefutably won. This was a war of raw, unyielding numbers, a conflict waged not by men in foxholes, but by millions of anonymous hands on assembly lines that stretched further than any battlefield trench. This was the place where contempt for the M5 Stuart was ultimately revealed as the most profound of German tactical errors. The narrative of American power was written in the vast, almost incomprehensible cathedral of the Willow Run bomber plant, a facility so enormous that it possessed its own internal road network and weather patterns. Here, the sheer awe-inspiring scale of production transcended mere economics and became a new form of martial philosophy. The air in these factories was thick not with gunpowder, but with the scent of machining oil and the incessant, deafening clamor of millions of stamping presses, a sound that, when properly interpreted, was the thunderclap of inevitable defeat for the Axis. The M5 Stuart, mocked for its armor, was in fact the perfect distillation of this overwhelming power. It was being churned out at a rate of 300 a month, a relentless torrent that ensured the field losses of 1 week were the statistical minimum for the next. When this single raw number was whispered into the intelligence reports of the German General Staff, it created a panic wholly disproportionate to the tank's individual combat power. They were not worried about the Stuart's 37mm gun. They were terrified by the 300 new vehicles that replaced every lost one. The technical deep dive into this mechanical juggernaut reveals the absolute triumph of standardization over bespoke excellence. The American lexicon of war was dominated by concepts like mass-produced radial engines, standardized ordnance, and interchangeable parts. A single design element, the commonality of the engines, the standardization of the hull bolts, ensured that a tank crippled in Tunisia could be fixed with a part manufactured in Michigan, shipped on a standardized pallet, and fitted by a non-specialist mechanic. This logistical cohesion was the strategic killer. The general's ability to run his Stuart squadrons 24 hours a day, generating the sound and traffic of a phantom division, was predicated entirely upon this unromantic, unyielding efficiency. The contrast between the two industrial cultures could be witnessed in the time-to-build metric. Across the Atlantic, the sleek, elegant, and technically superior German Panther tank was a testament to meticulous craftsmanship and precision engineering, a design philosophy that demanded 400 specialized man-hours to complete a single unit. This requirement was a logistical anchor, shackling the Wehrmacht to a finite supply of highly skilled labor and rare alloy components. Conversely, the corpulent, boxy American M4 Sherman, a design often derided for its compromises, was engineered for the most crucial specification of all: speed of manufacture. The Sherman required only 170 man-hours to roll off the line. This difference, a mere 230 hours, was the difference between victory and defeat. The General Motors and Chrysler tank arsenals were not merely building hundreds of tanks. They were building 32,000 of them over the course of the war. This was the source of the unlimited resources that Major Richter had witnessed and dismissed as waste. It was the continuous, unrelenting flow of material, the metaphor of hammers from heaven, not an isolated event, but a sustained, unstoppable deluge that never slackened. For the Germans, a lost tank was a hole in the line, a strategic wound that required months to heal. For the Americans, it was a momentary dip in a tide that was guaranteed to rise again. The American industrial machine, having perfected the art of civilian mass-market production, had simply retooled its entire effort. They were not fighting the war with military strategy alone, but with the devastating, unapologetic military business history of the world's most powerful economy. The deception in Tunisia was merely the general's way of forcing the enemy to confront the horrifying truth. They were not losing a battle against an army, but against an economic system that had achieved a production scale so immense that it could afford to substitute mere quantity for its opponent's coveted quality, winning the war of consumption before a single shot was fired. The battlefield, once the domain of tactical maneuver and calculated risk, now devolved into a stage for profound moral and material defeat. The shock wave of the general's deception, amplified by the immediate, shattering reality of the supply catastrophe it precipitated, began to fracture the German command not only at the strategic level, but deep within the psyche of the individual soldier. The analytical tone of command reports gave way to a somber acknowledgment of an enemy whose true power was not military, but almost geological, an unstoppable, self-replenishing force of material. In the weary, backward march of the disengaged German formations, the evidence of this industrial supremacy was everywhere, visible in the most humiliating, demoralizing detail. Consider the fate of the anonymous German farmer's son, a young panzer grenadier named perhaps Johann, who, after 2 days of relentless fighting and a final, desperate retreat, stumbled upon a sight that delivered a psychological wound far deeper than any American bullet. There, resting near a bombed-out crossroads, sat a perfectly good, abandoned American Jeep. Its engine block was intact, its tires firm, its only crime being that it had run out of fuel far from a main road and was simply deemed expendable by its crew. Johann's regiment was now moving by foot, relying on exhausted men and desperate horses, while the enemy, in a gesture of profound, contemptuous wealth, had simply discarded a functioning piece of specialized motorized transport. This was no isolated incident. The retreating Germans moved through a landscape littered with the unapologetic military business history of the United States. They found mountains of perfectly edible canned sea rations, meat, fruit, coffee, that had been dumped by rapidly advancing American supply columns to lighten loads or simply because the rations were the wrong flavor. To the German soldier subsisting on meager, meticulously allocated portions, this was not evidence of sloppiness. It was the irony of abundance used for waste. This level of deliberate, casual destruction of valuable materiel transformed the American military from a fighting force into a terrifying, unlimited engine of resource disposal. It was a concept mentally annihilating to men raised in a culture that meticulously conserved every scrap of metal, every liter of fuel, and every ounce of food. The true defeat was a defeat of philosophy. The Germans valued precision, quality, and scarcity. The Americans demonstrated that in modern warfare, unlimited resources trumped all. The light, despised M5 Stuart had fulfilled its ultimate mission not by penetrating German armor, but by delivering the crushing psychological truth. The enemy could afford to lose 3 of their flying milk bottles to every single Tiger, and they would still win because the factories never stopped turning and the oil never stopped flowing. This was the final, somber realization that fractured the German will to resist. The devastation was articulated in the bitter, exhausted voice of a German officer, perhaps Captain Meyer, surveying the wreckage of his motorized column after the artillery strike that followed the failed counterattack. He wasn't counting the bodies of his men, for that was a known, understood horror. He was looking at the shattered engines, the twisted steel, the pools of irreplaceable, burning petroleum. He might have been recorded in a primary source note, delivering the thesis of their doom with bleak finality. They were just gone, transformed into burning debris, he would say, referring not only to the destroyed tanks and trucks, but to the fundamental German belief in technical superiority and the finite, manageable scale of the conflict. His entire worldview, which hinged on the premise that German ingenuity could defeat brute force, had been annihilated by a calculated torrent of steel, and lead from an adversary who viewed their materiel as an endless, expendable asset. The general's tactic had not merely defeated a division, it had dismantled the moral conviction of a fighting force by forcing it to confront the horrifying truth of its own resource bankruptcy. The enemy's waste was their final, inescapable proof of an impending, inevitable defeat. The tactical victory achieved in Tunisia, driven by the illusion of the M5 Stuart light tank, was not merely a local triumph of maneuver. It was the elevation of a simple ruse into a profound, strategic, and ultimately ideological doctrine of overmatch. The general's unconventional tactic was never intended to outmaneuver the enemy in the classical sense, which valued finesse and economy of force. Instead, it was a brutal industrial mechanism designed to force the already stressed German command to overspend their resources on a phantom threat, thereby accelerating the single inevitable outcome of the war. It was less about defeating the enemy on the field and more about bankrupting them at the bank, demonstrating that the only purpose of the American military machine was to act as the sharp end of an inexhaustible, relentless economy. The stark truth lay not in the kinetic energy of a single shell impact, but in the abstract, cold mathematics of national capacity. The true battle of World War II was fought between the steel mills of the Ruhr and the furnaces of Pittsburgh, and the disparity was a devastating statistical reveal that dwarfed all tactical considerations. Throughout the year 1943, the German Reich, operating under the severe duress of total mobilization and strategic bombing, managed to produce a prodigious 16 million tons of steel, an impressive figure for a resource-constrained nation. This monumental effort, however, was immediately and tragically dwarfed by the output of the United States, which, despite maintaining a vast civilian economy, was concurrently pouring forth 90 million tons of steel. The difference between 16 million and 90 million was not merely a matter of industrial lead. It was a matter of destiny, a definitive, unbridgeable gulf between two fundamentally different conceptions of war. This quantitative difference meant that every German tank lost, every truck destroyed, and every shell fired represented a strategic expenditure that cut deep into a finite, dwindling reserve, requiring a heroic, specialized effort to replace. Conversely, every American piece of material, even the despised Stuart, was, at its core, a disposable product of surplus, a minor subtraction from a boundless national ledger. The general had correctly understood that if he could convince the enemy that they were facing a force commensurate with the 90 million tons of steel backing it, the German command would react with a panicked overcommitment that would burn through their meager 16 million tons of reserves, guaranteeing the collapse of their already fragile supply lines. The mathematics of defeat was being applied with cold, unforgiving authority. The ultimate final statistical devastation, the true cost of the conflict, measured in the currency of production, confirms the absolute truth of this doctrine of industrial overmatch. Throughout the entire course of the conflict, the German nation, the architect of the sophisticated Tiger and Panther tanks, would ultimately manufacture 46,000 tanks of all types and designations. This tremendous feat of engineering and sacrifice was a testament to their technical skill. Yet, standing against this total effort, against the German belief in quality over quantity, was the crushing reality of the American arsenal. The United States, the nation that produced the easily repaired, easily replaced, and occasionally maligned M4 Sherman and M5 Stuart, would ultimately produce 88,000 tanks of all types. The staggering difference between 46,000 and 88,000 was the sentence passed upon the Axis cause. The general's brilliant unconventional tactic, the use of light tanks to simulate heavy divisions, was therefore revealed to be merely the visible tip of the industrial iceberg. The true engine of victory was not the deception itself, but the sheer, relentless, awe-inspiring capacity of the American production line that made the deception believable in the first place. The M5 Stuart was the rhetorical foil, the cheap, fast-moving opening statement in a war where the enemy was defeated not by superior tactics, but by the relentless, continuous, and ultimately unapologetic avalanche of steel and lead that only 90 million tons of annual production could sustain. Years later, the conflict reduced to grainy photographs and the hollow echo of massive engine noise. The man who was once Major Klaus Richter walked the familiar streets of his fractured, rebuilt city, an anonymous older figure in a post-war landscape dominated by the endless supply of American Reconstruction aid. The Tiger. I was long gone, melted down into the functional, forgettable steel of civilian bridges and appliances, and the sharp, arrogant laughter that had defined his career in the Tunisian sun had vanished with it. Now, in the cold, clear light of retrospect, he carried only the silent, somber understanding of why they had lost the war. An understanding that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with the mathematics of destruction. He no longer laughed at the M3 Stuart. The machine that his men had once derided as a flying milk bottle had transformed in his memory from a tactical flaw into a cosmic symbol of the overwhelming force arrayed against the Reich. He realized that its thin armor and small gun were irrelevant variables in the ultimate equation. The Stuart was not a fighting vehicle. It was a logistical declaration, a kinetic proof of concept, built by an economy that valued time and speed of replacement over craftsmanship and tactical longevity. It was a visible, rapidly moving testament to the fact that the general's true genius lay in weaponizing the industrial processes of the free market itself. The Stuart's civilian-derived engine, once a cause for German mockery, was in fact its deadliest feature. It meant the machine could be produced, driven, and discarded faster than a Tiger's customized drivetrain could be repaired. The deception at Kasserine, the illusion of a heavy division forged from rubber, canvas, and ceaseless radio traffic, now stood revealed as a perfect strategic encapsulation of this new reality. The tactic of making the light tanks appear heavy was never truly about the steel thickness of the hull or the muzzle velocity of the gun. It was about the idea of unlimited power, the overwhelming psychological assurance delivered to the American forces that their every loss was instantly replaceable and simultaneously delivered to the Germans as the terrifying certainty that their every successful defense was strategically meaningless. The general had merely accelerated the German awareness of their own resource bankruptcy, utilizing the thin, fast-moving armor as a mirror to reflect the crushing disparity between 90 million tons and 16 million tons of annual steel production. The unconventional tactic was the final devastating flourish of a nation that had successfully weaponized its entire industrial and consumer economy into a singular, unyielding instrument of war. The point of view shifts now, transcending the reflection of a single soldier, to deliver the final, inescapable truth of the conflict. The war was decided long before Major Richter's Tiger was immobilized by that close air support thunderclap. The outcome was sealed in the cavernous, gleaming factories of the American Midwest. The greatest weapon deployed in the conflict was not the elegant, over-engineered Tiger IVs, nor the durable, corpulent M4 Sherman, but the assembly line itself, the relentless, unstoppable machine that produced 88,000 tanks and guaranteed the torrent of fuel that permitted the entire illusion to operate without pause. That constant, continuous flow, the sheer, unrelenting promise of manufactured abundance, was the only force that mattered. The general's success lay in forcing his enemy to fight the shadow cast by that manufacturing process, compelling them to exhaust their finite reserves against a ghost. It was the ultimate, cruelest rhetorical argument, a statement of industrial might, delivered not in the abstract, but in the terrifying immediate form of metal and fire. The doctrine of overmatch required only a glimpse of what was to come, a strategic suggestion of the avalanche that could never be stopped. The final, thesis-defining quote, "The cold, pragmatic core of the general's success," echoes across the years, an immutable truth in the history of mechanized conflict. "I didn't need to win the tank battle. I just needed to show them the shadow of what was coming."